Right now, we've looked at other continental wars of the 1700s, and we discussed the global nature of those wars and how they involved multiple powers. So sometimes it's a little bit of a misnomer that we label World War One, World War One. So we've certainly seen conflicts that have been on the continent that have spread to other continents, in the case of 7 Years' War, involving other powers. But this is beyond a scale that anything that ever happened. I mean, more people die in this in the last, in the combination of all the wars really for Europe in the last 200 years. And this is really something that they couldn't understand. And it touched on so many parts of the world. Um, the war really widens a great deal. As we look at the Eastern Front, the Austrian Front, and the Alpine Front, we find that they're much more fluid in those areas. They don't tend to totally fall into that stalemate of the Western Front. But regardless, Russia suffered very bad from this war, mainly because they just still didn't have the industrial base to deal with Germany. They had the people, and they could afford to fight a war of attrition, which is essentially what they do. But the casualties really pile up, and the costs really pile up for them. In 1915, Italy joined the Entente, switched sides in exchange for promise of Austrian territory at the end of the war. So certainly Italy is jumped on onto this war more. But it's really when we see the Ottomans join the Central Powers in the hopes of regaining lost territory in Europe and trying to revive its very waning empire, that we're seeing the war spreading into the Middle East. And the Ottomans are going to fight Russian forces mainly, but they're also going to have to fight the British as they invade the Dardanelles. And then we see Bulgaria jump into this war on the side of the Central Powers, hoping to gain territories from the Serbs in the Balkans. So a lot of people start jumping into this war thinking they have something to gain. And I really think when we try to understand where the Ottomans are in this is the sick man of Europe, and they're hoping to gain from this. And if you really look at the war in 1914, it really would seem that the logical victor would be Germany. It's become such an industrial military powerhouse. And so we can see that although we spend a lot of time looking at the Western Front, and for good reason, that's where so much fighting and so much death occurred in that war. We do see that, again, there are other fronts. The war started in the Balkans with Serbia and Austria, and so that war is still going on. And certainly the Eastern Front is a very large front. It is much more fluid than the Western Front, not compact trench warfare, but yet there's significant fighting going on there. So that two-front war, again, that Germany's trying to prevent, does happen, and in fact, the second front that they create becomes much worse than the other fronts. We have to understand this involves the majority of the powers of Europe and the majority of Europeans. I want to include in your packet a reading on Armenian genocide. So we're actually going to see that this war spills over and affects people that weren't responsible for the start of the war. In 1915, some Armenians welcomed the Russian armies as liberators. The Armenians had been oppressed by the Ottoman Turks for some time. And as Russia advanced onto Ottoman territory in the east, they started welcoming them. The Armenians in Ottoman territory were turned on by the Ottomans, and then they started trying to deport them away from those territories in which the Russians were gaining land, and eventually culminates in essentially a genocide against the Armenians, as many Armenians died of starvation and disease, and some openly murdered by the Ottoman Empire, which is something Turkey still, for the most part, denies to this day. So even in World War One, we see genocidal acts against different groups of people. In this case, we see genocidal acts against this Armenians in southeastern Europe against the Ottoman Turks. They feel that the actions of the Armenians are costing them the war. The British are also going to fight in the Middle East. Most famously in trying to take the Dardanelles and Istanbul. Naval and land forces attack those areas to try to take a strategic passageway from the Black Sea to the Aegean Sea and eventually to the Mediterranean. And so there's significant fighting there. And on top of it, there was also attempts to create Arab revolts against the Ottoman Turks. Most famously, T.E. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, goes there and tries to generate just successfully Arab revolts within the Ottoman Empire, hoping to keep the Ottoman Empire busy with internal strife to weaken their efforts in the war. They also do this actually with Palestinians as well, as they promised the Arab Palestinian population that they would obtain their own state if they would revolt against the Ottoman Turks. That promise is never going to be totally fulfilled, and of course, you can imagine the impacts that promise has on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in 1948, when Israel is given a state by the United Nations. That there's going to be a sense of betrayal that the Palestinians feel that the Westerners made these promises in World War One, and in fact, the British make promises in the famous Balfour Declaration to to European Zionists that they would get a state as well. So the British kind of play both sides on this, but again, the attempt is to create fighting in the Ottoman Empire. So we see fighting breaking out in the Middle East that is linked to this war. Here's the Gallipoli campaign to take the Dardanelles Straits away from the Turks. And when we look at the Widening War, perhaps the most significant thing that widens this for a lot of people is imperialism. The world is still carved up, and there's still colonies of these European powers, and so they start calling on the members of their colonies to fight on the Western Front. Here you can see a picture of Australians fighting on the Western Front. In fact, famously, it was the Australians from the trenches that claimed to have shot down the Red Baron. So I mean, there's connections there. But we see maybe around 1 million Asians and Africans served in the war effort in some capacity as they're being mobilized by their imperial governments. The war also moves into Eastern Asia. Japan moved on German lands, their German sphere in China, occupying it. The Japanese are our allies. The Japanese never sent forces to the Western Front, but they famously sent a great deal of shovels, which were used for digging trenches. But we see them using the war as an excuse to move on to German territory and expand their influence in Eastern Asia. As we talked about, Japan is, after the Meiji saw itself as a disturbed power, and then eventually began to see itself as an equal with European, and therefore should be engaging in imperialism, which is certainly going to culminate in the 1920s and 30s. So really what happens in the 20s and 30s in Manchuria and China is a continuation of this desire of Japan to engage in imperial activities, which they are doing in World War One. The one thing that really tips the scales on the Western Front is going to be American involvement in the war. It's something that the Germans and the Central Powers wanted to prevent. They thought that they would be able to prevent it. Certainly, Americans seem to be maintaining a neutrality. Yeah, I think in 1914, there's really no aircraft has not crossed the Atlantic. The Atlantic is a massive barrier to these conflicts, and why get involved? But as unrestricted submarine warfare or U-boat warfare started sinking American shipping, and shipping that and was disrupting the shipping industry for the United States, that really started to turn people in the United States against the Central Powers and even closer to the Allies, ever so slightly, just pulling them in the direction of being involved in the war. And most significantly is the sinking of the Lusitania. Although America does not join the war after the sinking of the Lusitania, this cruise ship that the Germans believe is bringing war supplies to England, it turns American opinion against Central Powers and more support away from isolationism and into involvement in World War One. And it wasn't Lusitania that got America into the war. In fact, it was the Zimmerman telegram that was seen as an act of war that pulled the United States into the war. You can see that Lusitania sunk on May 7th of 1915. 1,198 people were killed as it was torpedoed and sank rather quickly, giving people very little chance to escape. And there were Americans aboard. But the Zimmerman telegram is going to be the most significant thing into making the United States decide to declare war. The Zimmerman telegram was intercepted by the British. It was a telegram. It seems to be legitimate. There was questions at the time as if the British were just making this up to get America involved in the war because they so desperately needed more help. in fighting that stalemate on the Western Front, but it seems to be legitimate. The telegram was sent to the Mexican government, and essentially it said that, as we're going to read in class, that the Germans felt that they could win the war if they could just kick unrestricted submarine warfare up again, which they had abandoned since the Lusitania. They could cut off the supplies. They really thought they could overrun the British and French forces on the Western Front. So they just needed to be able to do that. The fear was, though, that the United States would become involved in the war, which was right. So the Zimmerman telegram proposed to the Mexican government that if the Germans start unrestricted submarine warfare, and the United States wants to jump in the war, that Mexico should invade and basically tie down the United States in a conflict on its own territory. In exchange, the Germans would win the war. Then, after winning the war, they would go to they would assist the Mexicans and help them reclaim territory that they had lost to the Americans in the previous century, territory that Mexico still believed, and to some extent, legitimately believed should be theirs and should be returned to them. So, when we return from spring break, we're going to actually look at the home front and the mobilization of the war. And you'll have already had the chance to actually look at a DBQ about the home front and mobilization of the war and industries in this total war that is World War I.